nomads, wanderers on a pristine planet. It was only, as Joseph Campbell said, during the Neolithic 12,000 years ago that we succumbed to the cult of the seed and the poetry of the shaman was displaced by the prose of the priesthood. And nomadic societies are profoundly different. Think about it. How do you measure wealth in a society in which there is a disincentive to acquire any material possessions? Well, wealth in this culture is explicitly defined as a strength of social relations between people, because if they fray, everybody suffers. There is no word for thank you in the Penan language because everything is reflexively shared. I once gave a cigarette to a Penan woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And in these cultures that lack the written word, there's a kind of interesting dialogue that goes on with the natural world, such that the flight of a bird can be kind of like the cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But unfortunately, by the time I arrived in the late 1980s, the sound of the forest had been the sound of machinery. And during the 80s, we heard so much about deforestation in the Amazon, but Brazil produced 1.3% of tropical log exports in 1985. Malaysia produced 45%, much of it from the homeland of the Penan. So I literally bore witness to the death of a people in a decade. Women forced into prostitution and servitude, rivers that once ran clear, so laden with silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea, children in forced settlement camps suffering from diseases not previously known to the people, men humiliated, rising up, blowpipes against bulldozers, in the end no match for the power of the Malaysian state. And so in a single generation, a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, ethically pure and true was destroyed along with the forest that gave it birth. And that forest was destroyed by the egregious industrial deforestation. And this way that we think of the natural world, we think it's the norm. In fact, viewed through the anthropological lens, it's the anomaly. Most cultures have a very different relationship with the natural world. That's precisely why, if climate change has become humanity's problem, we should always remember it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a narrow subset of humanity. And if you want to see for a moment the vision of an alternative, let's slip into the deserts of Australia. We know from studies of the Y chromosome that the ancestors of the Aboriginal people of Australia were the first people to walk out of Africa. Within 5,000 years, they traveled to the underbelly of Asia, crossed over to the most parsimonious of continents, and then they went walking. And they established 10,000 clan territories, all linked together by a single idea. Two ideas, really. The song line, which was a trajectory walked at the dawn of time by the ancestral beings who sang the world into existence, and the dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was the idea that the human being exists in multiple realms of reality at the same time. The earth at your feet both exists but is waiting to be born in the realm of the dreaming. Now, when the British arrived in Australia, they saw a people that looked strange, who had a simple material technology, but what really offended the British is that the Aboriginal people had no interest whatsoever in improving upon their material lot. Now, improving on your material lot was the very ethos of Victorian life at that time. So the British, in their inimitable way, concluded that the Aborigines weren't people at all, and they began to shoot them. As recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne, Australia, as to whether or not Aborigines were human or not. In 1950, ranchers had quotas as to how many abos they could shoot with impunity who trespassed upon their land. As recently as the 1960s, a school book used across the country listed the Aboriginal people as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife in Australia. And what was going on was a subtle devotional philosophy beyond the reach of the British, and that was the dreaming. If they had studied, or cared to study, the anthropological works of W. Stammer, he would have told them that the whole purpose in life in Australia was the opposite of improvement. It was stasis. It was constancy. It was the most conservative worldview in the history of humanity. The entire purpose of life wasn't to change anything. It was to do the ritual gestures in your clan territory deemed to be necessary to keep the world just as it was at the time of its creation. It would be as if all of Western intellectual energy had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keeping it just as it was at the time when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong, or who's better and who's worse. Had we followed this trajectory, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, but on the other hand, we wouldn't talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biological and physical life support systems of the planet. Well, if egregious industrial policy can be a threat to the ethnosphere, perhaps the most pernicious threat, of course, is ideology, be it the myth of modernity or the Marxist madness of Beijing cast down upon the peoples of Asia. This is a nun that I photographed at Angkor Wat, and she has had her feet and hands severed from her body for the crime of pursuing her religious faith. And in Tibet, when the Dalai Lama met Mao Zedong, incidentally, the man with the dubious distinction of having been responsible for the death by murder of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together, when Mao Zedong whispered into the ears of the Dalai Lama that all religion was poison, His Holiness knew what to expect. And when the jackboots of the Red Guard conquered Lhasa finally in 1959, 1.2 million Tibetans were killed for their religious faith. 6,000 temples, monasteries, and sacred structures were destroyed. Can you imagine how we'd feel as Americans if some huge power came into our country, declared our religion to be anathema, and proceeded to destroy every one of our churches, every one of our mosques and synagogues? That's what the Chinese did to the Tibetans. And what is it about the Buddhist Dharma that is so threatening to these Marxist materialists? It's all distilled in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life was negative. He just said that terrible things happen in life, and you have to deal with them. The cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth and the most consequential was the delineation of a contemplative practice, a religious practice that, if followed, had 2,500 years of empirical observation to suggest that indeed transformation of the human heart and spirit could be effected. And so I wanted to make a film on the Buddhist science of the mind. You know, why did I use the term science of the mind? Well, what is science but the pursuit of the truth? What is Buddhism but 2,500 years of empirical observation as to the nature of mind? And I was traveling with this wonderful friend. You can see that being with Mathieu Ricard in the Himalaya was rather like being with Friar Tuck in Sherwood Forest. He was the most extraordinary character I've ever met. His father was France's most famous philosopher. His mother was a painter. He grew up in a house of luminaries in Paris. He learned piano from Stravinsky. He learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson. He learned anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was studying molecular biology in the lab of a Nobel laureate outside of Paris, when one day he realized there was no correlation between wealth, fame, and happiness, so he went to where he had always been happy and became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And also with us on that journey of the heart was Sherer Barma, a traditional Amchi doctor seen here quizzically examining my urine sample. And our journey was facilitated by the late Trungpa Rinpoche, head of the Nyingma tradition and one of the teachers of the Dalai Lama. And we were going to Everest, but we weren't seeking a Western hero, you know, these characters who climb up onto the cold rock and ice into a zone of death where oxygen deprivation alone obliterates consciousness and awareness, which from the Tibetan point of view is just about the stupidest thing you can do with a precious incarnation. We wanted to go and be in the presence of a wisdom hero. This was a woman who had been very beautiful as a girl, wanted to pursue a religious life, forced to marry because of the poverty of her family. To escape her suitor, she crawled down a human latrine, covered with excrement, had come to the Temboche monastery. The lamas cleaned her up, dispatched her over the 23,000-foot Nangpala Pass into Tibet, where she became ordained as a Tibetan nun. She then crossed back over to a nunnery in Nepal and went into lifelong retreat as a Satampa Ani. And for 45 years, she had lived in a single cell with her food being brought to her every morning and every evening as she dedicated her entire life to the recitation of a single prayer, a single mantra. And because she was old and ill, Sherab was treating her. So we had a chance to go and meet her. And so we began at the Shiwang Monastery that clings like a swallow's nest to the mountains. We participated in the Mani Rindu ceremony, which commemorates the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet in the 9th century. We then began to walk toward Everest in a rather circuitous route, past the cave where Sherab, as part of his 7 years of medical training, had spent 1 full year in meditative retreat. And with Mathieu chanting the sutras, we came closer and closer until this next photograph was taken. And this photograph was taken the first moment sunlight fell on this woman's face in 45 years. Now, by the terms of reference of our culture, she should have been mad. But the face that greeted me radiated loving compassion. And Mathieu said to me, "This is your proof of the science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism, the serenity achieved by the practitioner." And later that night at a nearby monastery, a lama said to me something really wonderful. He said, "We in Tibet don't believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do." And the Tibetans chart their future on the Diamond Sutra, a candle in the wind, the moon fading in the dawn. And they leave it to us to ask why we continue to tolerate the wrath of China that every day does more to destroy this incredible cultural and religious tradition that has given so much to the world. Well, in the end, we have to ask the question, what kind of world do we want to live in? This is not about romanticism or even human rights. It's about how do we find a way that all people can benefit from the best of modernity without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. Because culture is not trivial. It's not decorative. Culture isn't the songs we sing, the prayers we utter. Culture ultimately is about a body of moral and ethical values that every culture places around each individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history sadly teaches us lies within all human beings. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in the universe, to follow the words of Abraham Lincoln and seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost and the constraints of tradition are lost, an individual through coercion or volition are cast adrift into an uncertain world where too often they simply secure a place in the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere, you just have to look at the points of chaos around the world. The Genocide Museum in Kigali. And the idea is not to freeze people in time. It's not the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free peoples to choose the components of their lives. And that is something that nation states have finally caught on to. My own country of Canada was not always kind to the Inuit. When the British first arrived in the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the English to be gods. Both were wrong. And what the British couldn't understand was that there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in a harsh Arctic environment where everything had to be forged by the cold or carved from bone, stone, and ivory. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were made of fish. The thwarts of their sleds were made of meat. They always would say that if you get lost in the barren lands, at least you can eat your sled. This is a photograph I took polar bear hunting 250 miles out on the sea ice. That night, the temperature dropped to minus 65 degrees Celsius before the wind came up. They made an igloo. We ate meat. Blood on ice, despite what Greenpeace tells you in the Arctic, is not a sign of death. It's an affirmation of life itself. And when I was narwhal hunting at the tip of Baffin Island, I recorded a fantastic story from a dark period of Canadian history when we forced the Inuit into settlements to establish our sovereignty in the 1950s. And Olayak, the man on the left's grandfather refused to go, so the family took away all of his tools and weapons, thinking that that was going to force him into the settlement. But it didn't. The old man slipped outside of the igloo into the darkness of an Arctic night, pulled down his caribou-hide trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces froze, he shaped into the form of a blade. He put a spray of saliva along the leading edge. When the implement forged from human waste, forged by the coal, took final shape, he used it to kill a dog. He skinned it and used the skin of the dog to improvise the traces of a sled, improvise the sled from the rib cage of the dead dog, and then what the Inuit call a shit knife in belt disappeared into the Arctic night. Talk about getting by with nothing. But of course, now the Inuit, like all the polar peoples, are suffering from something they cannot control: climate change. This is a photograph I took in the northernmost human community, where the ice used to come in September, stay till July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. So the entire way of life of the Arctic is literally melting from beneath the people. Now, one final story. In the wake of 9/11, I wanted to tell a story of Islam. I wanted to take our audience into the deserts of North Africa. I wanted to remind Americans and Canadians that at a time when Paris and London were mud hovels, Timbuktu had 25,000 university students. I wanted to remind people in Europe that the only reason the knowledge of the Greeks survived to inspire the Renaissance was because it was preserved in the documents of the Arab world. Documents in Timbuktu which you can hold into your hand, documents from the 10th century. I also wanted to take that audience deep into the desert on the same route that once carried 2/3 of Europe's gold from West Africa before the discovery of the New World. I wanted to take them to an ancient salt mine in the desert, 1,000 kilometers north of Timbuktu, where great slabs of magical salt have been cut out of the ground for 1,000 years. Salt that at one time traded ounce for ounce with gold across the trade routes of West Africa. A route that every Tamachek or Berber or Bedouin boy must do before he can marry, because it's only by the journey through the desert that hones his devotion to Allah. And we never knew who these men were that kept coming onto our expedition, but they had guns, which was sort of a good thing. And eventually we got to the mine where it was a totally biblical scene. My friend Isa Muhammad, a Tuareg, took one look and he said, "I would not bring my wife here." And we asked some of the smugglers from Mauritania, I said, "Well, what country are you from?" And they just said, "There are no countries here." And two events happened that I'll never forget. This man was the only person in the history of the mine who had spent every summer there. He had borrowed money from a moneylender to save the life of a child and had never been able to escape the debt. His body was worn out, although he was younger than me, and he lived in a hut of salt with no possessions except what was on his back. And when he told me the size of his debt, it was less than the cost of a dinner here in Beloit for 4 people. So I gave him the money. He thanked me, and as he thanked me, a sandstorm swept through the mine and enveloped him in a kind of yellow haze. And I never discovered whether he used the money to get home to his family. Was he pulling my leg? Did he get killed for the money? But as I went south, we came upon a caravan we had met on the way north. And a strange rainstorm had struck this caravan. If the salt gets wet, it breaks and loses all value. So the caravan, with no margin of error, had been forced to stop for 5 days in the desert to let the salt dry out, and they had run out of water, and they were 250 miles from the nearest well. In the desert, you can live for days without food, but you die of thirst within 24 hours. In fact, one of the sayings of the truck smugglers of Mauritania is that the great thing about brake fluid is it keeps you off the battery acid. They were down to 1 single liter of water. They were sending this guy away to walk 25 miles to a point in the desert where they hoped to dig down 6 feet to find some water. And what did they do with that last liter of water of theirs? They immediately kindled a fire and brewed us tea, honoring the Bedouin obligation to kill the last goat that keeps your children alive in order to feed the wandering stranger who comes in out of the night, because you never know when you will be that stranger hungry and cold in seek of shelter and support. And in the wake of 9/11, when all of this hysteria was just spinning up about the Islamic world, as I watched Muhammad pour me a cup of tea, I thought to myself that this is why I'm an anthropologist. This is why I've traveled as I have, because these are the moments that allow us all as human beings to hope. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a couple of questions, and Steve Averiss is running around with the mic as well as me. So if somebody might have a question, I'll come over there.
Forgive me, I arrived a little bit late, but I'm going to address you as doctor. I hope that's okay.
You'd be the first person ever to do it. So.
I just want to, number one, I want to thank you for the last 45 minutes. My mind has been to places I'll never go in my life. Not only physically through the photographs that you've taken, but more so, and I think in the stories that you've shared. And it's truly remarkable. Never met or heard anyone quite like the eloquence which you addressed us in this last 45 minutes.
Well,
so thank you.
Very kind of you.
I can't help but think that there are very few human beings who've traveled the world and studied and learned in the ways that you have about these different cultures. And it just bears a question, I think, about the fact that as you describe the genetics being so comparable from person to person, how does that manifest itself, that continuity that you see when you look into these different cultures and these people's eyes? What is it that is one common thread?
What is so fascinating about anthropology is, I may seem to have stressed the differences, but the fascinating thing is our commonality. Every single culture faces the same adaptive imperatives. We all have to find ways to have children, to couple in a way that's consistent. I mean, marriage rules change dramatically, but in every society there are consistent marriage rules that are not to be broken. We have to deal with the agony of old age. We have to deal with the inexorable mystery of death. I mean, if you really think about it, death is the first teacher. It's the edge beyond which life is, it ends and wonder begins, and how any culture deals with that inexorable separation defines its metaphysical worldview. So what I find interesting about anthropology is that every culture has the same adaptive challenges, and what's so cool is how many different ways we've come up with to deal with them, and that's the kind of the balance that I find is so interesting. So that when you go into the field, part of what the one thing I've learned to do is, and I've been able to do this since I was a little boy. Like when I was a little kid, my mom decided that Spanish was the language of the future. And we had no money, but she worked herself raw to be able to allow me to join this group of boys from my school that were being taken by a teacher to Colombia. And I was 14, and all the other boys were 16 and 17. And they all were with these rich families, and I was lucky to be with a more modest family. I never saw the other Canadians, and they were all hopelessly, what they say in Colombia, mamitas, which is homesick. They were always whining and complaining, and all the other mothers apparently were on the phone saying, why can't they be like little Guillermo? He's so happy. Well, I wasn't homesick. I felt I had finally found home, and I've always been like that, And part of what's the glorious thing about doing fieldwork is that people often think that, how do you establish connection to what seems to be superficially exotic people? And, sometimes the implication is that it's bravado, but it's never bravado. It's always empathy and love. And, the same things that would make me welcome in your house at Thanksgiving are the things that would make me welcome in a ger in Mongolia. Good manners, a willingness to help out, self-deprecating humor, a willingness to eat what's put in front of me and sleep where I'm asked to sleep. So it's not that complicated. I've always been astonished how many people, when confronted by the cross-cultural moment, express fear, are fearful, and that often finds itself into awkwardness or whatever. And I've just never had that problem. I mean, the main thing people would say to me in Haiti was always, "Qui qualité blanc sayo?" What kind of white are you anyway? You know. And one of the big Hougans said, "Il n'est pas blanc, il est indien." He's not white anyway. He's Indian. You know, I mean, so I think that's the sort of the balancing thing, you know. Yeah. And you know, again, the other point worth making, 2 points worth making. Anthropology is sometimes accused of embracing a love for every culture but its own, or embracing an extreme relativism whereby every trait of culture must be defended because it exists. You know, as if you defend the Nazis because they had a weird ideology and a religion or whatever. You know. No, anthropology, as my professor always said, never calls for the elimination of judgment. It calls only for the suspension of judgment, so the very ethical and moral judgments that the very judgments that we're ethically and morally obliged to make as human beings can be informed ones. So no one, you know, would hesitate to condemn the Nazis, but the anthropological lens becomes more useful when it points to a phenomenon about which we know nothing, but of which we cast judgments. Voodoo is a good example. The other thing is that you know, anthropology has always had this activist component, going back to Franz Boas. I mean, you mentioned some wonderful quotes. You know, Ruth Benedict said the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for differences. And today, especially, it can be the antidote to the kind of nativistic, anti-immigrant stuff that's going on in this country, amongst others. But the most important thing is to recognize that you know, none of this is to condemn our culture, of course not. But it's to suggest modestly that no culture is perfect, and no culture is a paragon of humanity's potential, and that the greatest curse in the history of humanity has been cultural myopia. The idea that, you know, I'm not really a culture, I'm the real world, they're the cultures out there. And, you know, we always say that about ourselves as Americans, and it's sort of true, but we're not alone. I mean, the tribal names of most societies translates the people. The obvious implication is being that everybody beyond the hill is a savage. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbarous, one who babbles. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. When Herodotus came back from his travels, Plato wanted him murdered when he had the audacity to say that these other cultures had something to say. And that kind of cultural myopia, which is ubiquitous, is the biggest curse of humanity. So what I always try to say, like, you take us, you know, and of course what we've done in the West, not just the States and Canada, but Europe, we've always measured success by technological achievement. We just stack the deck in our favor, right? So naturally we come out on top. But if you look at our social structure, and see, I always say, like, if a Martian came to Canada, you know, he, she, or it, or States, they're both the same. No, they're not the same, but I mean, they're really not the same. I'm Canadian. No, I mean, no, but I mean, essentially, you know, the Martian would look at our social structure and ask some very obvious questions. You guys love marriage, but half your marriages end in divorce. You say you love your grandparents, but only 6% of your homes have grandparents and grandchildren beneath the same roof. You say you love those kids, and I know you do, but you've got this weird slogan you keep talking about 24/7, implying total dedication to your workplace at the expense of family, which may explain why the average American youth by 18 has spent, boy or girl, 3 full years looking at a video screen, right? Contributing to an obesity epidemic so severe that your Joint Chiefs of Staff write op-eds in the national newspapers calling it a national security issue. I know you're very happy, but you do consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs as you put 400 million tons of toxic waste into your rivers and celebrate an economy that defines economic well-being as perpetual growth on a finite planet, which some people here at Mars would say is the economics of delusion. In other words, it's not that there's anything wrong with us, but every culture needs a little bit of humility, you know, including the Yanomami. I mean, every culture. This is our big challenge. How are we going to live in a multicultural, pluralistic world, and how can we celebrate that world? Because the alternative is very grim. That's why anthropology is not about nostalgia, and it's not about human rights, and it's not about romanticism. It's about geopolitical stability. That's why the most important subject that any young person can study is anthropology. That's what the poet Gary Snyder once told me. The only things we're studying are biology and anthropology. And it's to the great credit of this college that it is a center of anthropology known across the country as one of the few colleges that actually brings together aspiring anthropologists at the undergraduate level. And it's a wonderful thing.
Do we have one more question? Does anybody?
You talked about us all being related, but we're related to the plants too. And I've heard it said that plants communicate with us chemically. Could you address that?
Well, I've changed my mind about this a little bit. My friend Tim Plowman, there was a book that came out in the 70s called The Secret Life of Plants. Do you guys remember that book? Big bestseller, in which, they said plants like Mozart and they like you to touch them and everything. And my friend Tim, who's a poet, a musician, and a great botanist, hated that book. And he used to say, "Why? There are some kids here, so why would a plant give up about Mozart? And even if it did, why should that impress us? They can eat light. Isn't that enough?" And so I've always been sort of suspect about that touchy-feely kind of, but that said, I'm saying that I've changed my tune because there has been some incredible research done recently about chemical communication in plants. For example, there's a wonderful forester at UBC where I teach who has discovered that in the temperate rainforest, there are such a thing as mother trees. And mother trees, like a giant cedar, will, through the manipulation of chemical flows through the mycorrhizal connections of the forest floor, will literally direct nutrients on a hierarchical scale. So seedlings of herself will get most of the nutrients. Seedlings of her species, but of another individual tree, get the next tier. And literally, they've figured out that it works its way down to, the spruce. And so there's all kinds of stuff happening that I think the jury's out on. So, but I'm definitely of that school that you don't need to make it up, because what really happens is more beautiful than anyone can ever say. I'm the only person in the history of Harvard who ever got thrown out of a library for making too much noise when I discovered the Krebs cycle. I just couldn't believe it, because I came to biology so late, and so all these metabolic pathways that always intimidate young students, to me they just read like origin myths. And so I memorized them effortlessly, but I would just go up to like a postman and say, "Do you know how photosynthesis works? Man, it's incredible." And I actually one night got thrown out of the Science Center library, and that was the night I figured out respiration. Any other, maybe?
Yeah.
You've all been very
One
patient.
more question? Is there anybody with one more question?
Well, no, the thing is that, the writing informs the speaking informs the writing. I was very fortunate, I write out every speech to the word, and then you deliver it